I was asked by a good friend to look at their string trimmer, but when I asked them questions about it, they really didn't have any answers to give me. But that's okay, we'll just look at the machine and see what it has to say, but sometimes the answers are always the same. And that is, they've been neglected to a point and they won't start and run anymore. Now it's time to make up for all that neglect, all the while hoping that it's not too far gone to be saved. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Craftsman branded string trimmer, and the problem is that, according to my friend, it simply will not start. Now, some of you watching might be questioning if the machine is worth fixing, but the short answer is yes, just so long as the engine isn't too worn out. But at least it is a straight shaft, which more consumers seem to choose over the other styles. And speaking about worn out, the rope on this machine seems to be quite easy to pull over as shown by this crude pull test. If the engine was healthy, the whole machine would quite easily come off the table, but it seems to want to stay there instead. Now it's not terrible, but if it was much worse than this, we'd have to use the compression tester to see how worn out the engine is. Next, we'll continue inspecting the machine for any other problems it might have, and besides some discolored fuel lines and a purge bulb, it's in great condition. So I did notice some fuel at the bottom of the filter cover, which means fuel must be leaking from the carb. And because of that, we need to open the carb to see if there's a problem with it. I didn't show it, but this machine did have some fuel in the tank, so we might as well read the instructions and try starting it. Now the first real test is whether or not the purge bulb will fill with any fuel. Because if it doesn't fill with any, the likelihood that the engine will start will be very low. But luckily this one is filling, so we'll choke the carb and then try pulling on the rope. So unfortunately, it didn't even try and start, but the instructions don't say what to do when this happens. So in this case, we'll turn the choke off, guessing that the engine is flooded, and then try starting it again. Of course, it's not going to start, and that was the problem with it, according to my friend, so they were right. But I do know this engine can run, and that's because I showed that it could in a different video. That means we're going to take the fuel system apart and see if there's any reason why it's not working like it should be. So what are the possible causes for this no starting problem? Well, in this case, the carb seems to be the most likely suspect. But it could also be bad fuel, a leaking gasket between the carb and the engine, or even a problem with that gasket. So this part is the pumping side of the carb, and if it was bad, it would at least try and start. But by the looks of the pumping diaphragm, and also because of the material it's made of, this is not the problem. Next, we want to check the round inlet screen and see if it might be clogged, but as you can tell, it's quite clear, so we need to check the last diaphragm. That would be the metering diaphragm, which is located underneath this metal plate. Now it's supposed to be flexible, that way it'll be able to work the rocker arm that's located underneath it. So at first glance, everything seems to be okay with it. However, if you try to move it, you'll realize that it's begun to harden, which is not good. But here's where most have a problem with this diaphragm. They'll take it off the carb, and when they do, it makes it really tough to tell if it's bad. But as you can tell by that sound, this diaphragm sounds very crunchy, which it's not supposed to be. Now depending on how bad the diaphragm is, there is a way to save it, and that's by soaking it in a rejuvenation bath. I don't use this method as often as I used to, but it's a nice trick for those hard to find diaphragms. This diaphragm, however, is very common, and I happen to have a new one that we'll be installing in this carb. So it doesn't look exactly like the old one, but what matters most is the size of the stem in the middle, which in this case is the shorter one. So just be careful, because if you put the wrong one in your carb, it could cause it not to work at all. But if you don't want to worry about finding the right one, then I'd recommend just ordering a new carb instead, mainly because it's a much easier choice. Now this carb is not special, so there's no real harm in ordering a new one, but for higher quality machines, most try to save the original carbs. Now even though this purge bulb is not broken, we're going to replace it, since doing so is just cheap insurance. Now these purge bulbs can be pricey for what they are if you buy a single one. So I'd recommend ordering a multi-pack of them to make each one a lot cheaper, and then just sell off what you don't need. And once the carb is back together, we just need to redo the fuel lines, then we'll be able to install it. Now because the way the fuel lines aren't matching, mainly by color, I'm guessing someone replaced only one of the fuel lines fairly recently. There are no rules when it comes to servicing your machine, so if you only want to change one fuel line, you're welcome to. Heck, I've even done it. But just realize that it'll probably end with one fuel line failing before the other instead of both of them aging together. The first line I'll be running will be the fuel filter line, and to make it somewhat easier to install, I'll cut the end at an angle. I'll then use my pliers to pull several inches of fuel line into the tank. We'll then pull the line out, cut the angle piece off, and then install the fuel filter. I will let you know that this process can be challenging even to someone who's done it many times before, so don't get discouraged. Once the filter is installed, we'll push it back into the tank, making sure that it'll come to rest at the opposite end of the fuel tank. This will help to make sure that it'll still be able to pick up fuel if you're using your trimmer as an edger. We'll then cut the fuel line close to length and then do the same procedure for the fuel return line. Now you can use the wire method to help install these lines, but I'm just too stuck in my old ways to change from the way I'm used to doing it. Maybe someday I'll try the wire method, but for right now, I'm just going to stick with this one. So when connecting the fuel lines, the filter line will connect to the brass port further away from the bulb, while the return line goes to the one closer to it. And once the lines are connected, we'll then hook up the throttle cable and then install the carb to the engine along with the airbox. But before we try and start the engine, we need to do a flow test to make sure fuel is flowing through the system as it should be. Otherwise, the engine will either not start, but if it does start, it'll run for about 5 minutes before stopping, and you may never get it to start again. The fuel oil mix I'm using contains fresh 100% gasoline, which means it has no ethanol in it, and it's also been stabilized too. So when pressing on the purge bulb, fuel will come up the filter line into the carb, fill the bulb, and then return back to the fuel tank through the return line. And as you can see, fuel is flowing the way it's supposed to, but if you don't see any fuel, then it might be a bad carb or a fuel filter. One last item I want to look at, and that is the spark plug. If the gap on the plug is too small or too large, it could affect how the engine starts and runs. The surprising part is that the spark plug looks to be brand new, at least by the lack of any carbon on the tip of the plug. They probably changed it out while trying to get the engine to start the last time they tried to use it. So I like to set my spark plug gaps to 25 thousandths of an inch, and that's mainly by choice and a tiny bit of laziness. But you are welcome to set your gap to a different value. Finally, we'll purge the air from the system, choke the carb, and then try starting the engine. So it started and ran, but didn't stay running, but I do think it's worth another shot though. So after starting the engine a second time, the engine stayed running, and it seems to be running quite well too. But does that mean we have to retune the carb? Well, that's up to you. I know some would say to check the tune to make sure it's right where it needs to be, while others would say don't touch it unless it needs it, which I'm okay with either approach. As of right now, all I'm going to do is start it from cold a couple of times just to make sure it starts reliably, which I think is the most important part. I mean, what's the point in tuning a carb to make it run well only to make it tough to start? I'd rather it start easily each and every time and only run okay than not at all. I know there's a trade-off in performance, but I'm a simple person and getting it to start needs to be as simple as possible. So my question is, would you tune the carb on this engine if it already starts and runs just fine, or would you just leave it as it is? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.